My own Air Force unit transported 2 regiments of special forces to Pleiku in order to retake Ban Ma Thuột. But to our complete surprise, on the 14th, there was an order to withdraw from Pleiku. Nobody could believe it.
President Thieu made a crucial decision. He ordered his forces to abandon the northern and central provinces and form a new line of defense further south. But hoping to avoid panic, he did not announce the withdrawal or reveal his plans. As the rumors flew, fear spread. Nobody knew what to believe, and nobody wanted to be left behind.
During the withdrawal, the Air Force obviously was using their airplanes to get out any way they could. Mixed in with all of this, as if it wasn't complicated enough, was the panic-stricken flight of tens of thousands of civilians and dependents. In many instances, the military forces up there had their own families living with them in Kon Tum Pleiku area. That meant that they had to be extremely concerned about the protection and survival of their own family. At a time when they were attempting to retreat whatever of their forces were remaining back to the coast.
Ban Ma Thuột fell, but the government said nothing. We only learned about the withdrawal from Pleiku from rumors. The administration issued no official announcements at all. Because of that silence, people stopped believing in the government.
The official silence panicked the population. Within days, thousands of civilians were streaming toward the coastal city of Da Nang, desperately seeking safety. The communist leaders, surprised by the Saigon army's disintegration, now moved swiftly. They set a deadline: victory before the rainy season bogged down their troops. Dung's forces closed in on Da Nang.
The BBC and VOA broadcasts said that Da Nang was about to fall, and that news further spread panic among us soldiers. Our officers had fled. We talked things over among ourselves and then decided, let's go home.
By March 21st, 100,000 refugees, many of them troops and their families, had crowded into Da Nang. Some soldiers put their wives and children aboard ships headed for safer areas in the south. Many failed to get out.
Soldiers here are confused. As you walk down the street, you'll see soldiers with no shoes, just staring into space. I think this panic is a word that describes very well what's happening in Da Nang. We've heard that a plane ticket now to Saigon is over 100,000 piastres if you can afford it. And of course that means that the rich leave and they take all their belongings.
None of the civilian and military planes could land at the Da Nang airport because every time they approached, crowds chased after them in jeeps or motor scooters, trying to get on the planes and go to Saigon.
A World Airways jet with company president Ed Daly aboard made a perilous landing at Da Nang. Daly was flying one last rescue mission against official American advice. He wanted to save women and children first, but desperate soldiers jammed into the airplane. They scrambled into the baggage compartment and clung to the stairway as the plane took off. It was the last American flight out of Da Nang. On the 30th of March, General Dung's forces captured Da Nang, sweeping across the vast airbase where the first U.S. ground forces had landed in 1965. For one of his military camera team, TrzNH was home.
I arrived there on the 31st, the day after liberation. Along the road, I saw many corpses of Saigon troops. Their weapons and uniforms, which they had stripped off, were strewn all over the place. As we entered the city of Da Nang, we encountered a group of disbanded Saigon soldiers. They had been hiding in a graveyard, and they stood up to surrender to us. When I found my family, I saw my mother for the first time in 20 years. Before we could say a single word, we embraced each other and wept. During the conversations with my family, I learned that all my nephews had become Saigon soldiers.
Many Vietnamese families had members fighting on both sides. Now, some were reunited for the first time in decades. Offshore, refugees from Da Nang were packed aboard rescue ships. Thousands drowned trying to flee or were suffocated in the crush. As Thieu's army crumbled, the hysteria spread south.
Confusion spread even further in the army when rumors multiplied that Vietnam would be again partitioned. Soldiers couldn't understand why ships were being sent to central Vietnam to evacuate their families. If there was going to be another partition, why should they continue to fight? And why should they leave their families stranded out there?
President Thieu, still believing that America would not abandon him, again pleaded for help. On April 2nd, he met with Ambassador Martin and President Ford's special envoy, General Frederick Wyand. Wyand promised to recommend more aid, but by now the Americans were losing faith in Thieu. Wyand reported to Kissinger and Ford at Palm Springs. They concluded that a military deadlock was their best hope. Even if only part of South Vietnam could be defended, the communists might agree to a political deal, with or without Thieu.
General Wyand came back and recommended $722 million in additional military aid and assistance to make sure that the South Vietnamese would have adequate military hardware to create the stalemate. I was always hopeful that there could be a negotiated settlement, even at that late date in March and April of 1975.
Ford again asked Congress for aid, but members of Congress suspected a maneuver to blame them for the impending disaster. They rejected his request.
We've sent, so to speak, battleship after battleship, and bomber after bomber, and 500,000 and more men, and billions and billions of dollars. If billions and billions didn't do at a time when we had all our men there, how can 722 million save the day?
Can the South Vietnamese government, under President Thieu, or under any other leader, whatever the South Vietnamese decide among themselves, handle this situation?
Well, I think the test is that they have handled it. And I think the government can handle it in the future, can become self-sufficient, can keep their freedom, and allow us, when we end our involvement here, to withdraw, as I think we should, leaving South Vietnam economically viable, militarily capable of defending itself with its own manpower, and free to choose its own government, its own leaders, as its people themselves may freely determine. This is a goal which is easily within our reach.
It seemed to me there was no question that the South, what was left of the South, was in imminent jeopardy, and that there was no way of regaining the northern half of the country. Well, Martin wouldn't believe it. And Martin held to this optimistic view of the military situation almost to the end. And this was one of the problems in his approach to the evacuation question.